Welcome to Lesson 3, the Intake and Interview. This shows the full steps of the intake and interview process that each volunteer will go through with every single taxpayer that comes into the tax sites. The taxpayer will first fill out an intake sheet, and then the volunteer will complete an interview. You will check their identification and individual tax forms, prepare the return, and then have another volunteer do a quality review. Now we're going to go through each of these steps one by one. When a taxpayer comes to the tax site, the very first thing that he or she will do is to fill out this intake form. This is all their basic information right here at the top, their name, their address, birthday, etc. And then below that, it would be the same for their spouse if there was one. This form will also help you determine their filing status and how many dependents they have. As you can see down here in Part 2, it's the marital status and household information. This is the section you will use to determine their filing status. If they're single with no dependents listed down there, then they'll most likely qualify as single. If they're single with dependents listed below, they may qualify as single or head of household. And then I just want to point out that we do have a lesson on filing status, dependents, and exemptions, and I encourage you to watch that training video if you have more questions about that specifically. Below the marital status section, you can see by this green arrow here, it says, list the names below of everyone who lived with you and or anyone you supported but did not live with you during the tax year. Sometimes this section gets a little confusing for the taxpayer, so it's extremely important to go over this section and really every section of the intake form with each and every taxpayer. This section, which is directly to the right of where the household members are listed, will be completed by a certified volunteer before completing the tax return. So that means if there is someone listed in this section of household members, you have to complete this section here in gray. So what these questions are asking will basically help the tax preparer determine if anyone listed here will be the taxpayer's dependents. Again, if you have questions about this, you can refer to Lesson 4 on filing status, dependents, and exemptions. But basically here in the gray boxes, can this person be claimed by someone else as a dependent on their return? Did the person provide more than 50% of their own support? These are all questions that will help the preparer determine if this person is a dependent. This is page 2 of the intake form, and this is really where the interview that the volunteer does takes place. We just went over kind of the first part of the interview while we were talking about the first basic information part of the intake form, because the interview we're talking about is really just going through this intake form with the taxpayer, asking questions, answering their questions. So this slide shows page 2. And then this is where the taxpayer will indicate what types of income they had for the year, what expenses they had, and what major life events occurred that may impact their taxes. I want you to notice a few things on this form. First, there are 3 columns, yes, no, and unsure. It's very common for taxpayers to mark unsure, obviously, if they don't understand the question, if they don't know if their forms indicate this type of income or expense. So every time you see that unsure box checked, you really need to go over that, ask questions, answer their questions. And you always need to make sure before you move on to completing the tax return that all those unsure boxes are changed to a yes or a no. All questions need to be answered with a yes or a no before you can complete their tax return. The next thing you should notice is that each question has a letter or set of letters in parentheses before the question. These letters indicate the type of certification needed to prepare that return. Certifications are basic, health savings account, advanced, cancellation of debt, military certification. So if you're completing the interview and you notice that you don't have the proper certification, you need to stop and find another volunteer at the tax site to do that tax return. So as you can see here on 6 and 7, If someone came in and they had alimony income, that's okay for someone who is certified as basic to complete the return. But if someone who has self-employment income comes in, someone who's basic cannot complete that return. It needs to be someone who is certified as advanced. While we go through this interview, we will also be checking the taxpayer's identification and tax forms. Every taxpayer that comes to the site needs to have a government-issued photo ID and their Social Security cards or I-10 letters. It's the same for the spouse if there is one on the return. And then for the dependents, the taxpayer will need to have each dependent's Social Security card with them. And then, of course, the taxpayer will need to bring in all of their relevant tax documents. Now, when you're going through that list of income and expenses, you'll be able to check that they have brought in all of their documents that correspond to those questions. There are two other sections to be aware of on the intake form, and the first one is this little section about health insurance. This is new within the last 3 years that you are required to show proof that you had health insurance during the tax year. What you need to know for the interview is that taxpayers will need to bring their health insurance tax forms with them to the site. So this could be, you see here in number 2, Form 1095B or Form 1095C, or if they have insurance through the marketplace, it will be a 1095A. And this last section, the additional information, also needs to be filled out. Oftentimes the taxpayers forget to fill this portion out, so when you're doing the interview, you can ask these questions together and fill the form out together. After a thorough interview with a taxpayer, you would complete their tax return, and when you're finished, the return needs to be quality reviewed. Every return needs to be checked by someone other than the volunteer who prepared it, and we call this process a quality review. The volunteer doing the quality review will start by going over the intake sheet and asking the taxpayer any questions they may see. The taxpayer should be just as engaged with the volunteer doing the quality review as the original volunteer that prepared the return. So we can see here that there's a process you go through. While you're doing the quality review, you verify ID with photo ID and Social Security cards. You check to make sure the volunteer and you as a quality reviewer are certified to review the return. If the original return was advanced, then a basic preparer cannot do the quality review. It would need to be someone who is also advanced. You need to make sure all those unsure boxes have been changed to yes or no. You need to go into the tax return on the computer and make sure that all information on that intake form was correctly transferred to their return. So you're going through everything that the original volunteer entered into the computer to make sure that it's correct. We all make mistakes occasionally, so it's extremely important that someone else looks it over. Having a second pair of eyes focusing on this quality review offers the best opportunity to correct any errors. Thank you for watching this training video, and if you have any questions or comments, you can contact volunteer@refundohio.org.